Hi, folks. I'm Lena Frage. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, the NRDC. I work in our nature program on our pollinators and pesticides team, where I try to reduce or eliminate the unnecessary use of pesticides, particularly neonicotinoids or neonics. And one of the main campaigns that I work on is in Colorado. And so I am going to dig a little bit deeper into the impacts of neonics and their prevalence in our environment. I'm kind of going to speak more generally about the environmental impacts as well as impacts on human health. And then after that, I will pass it to Jacqueline. So maybe that's a good time to segue into your intro, Jacqueline.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lena. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be joining you all this evening. Really excited to speak with this group. My name is Jacqueline Buenrostro, she, her pronouns. I am on the pesticide reduction team with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and I work on our policy efforts as they touch pesticide reduction. So if you haven't heard of us before, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, it's sort of in our name. We work to conserve invertebrates, and really our mission is to protect the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their natural habitats. So we are basically a collection of bug nerds who are really passionate about this, and we work on everything from, endangered species conservation to habitat restoration, pesticide reduction on the team that I'm on, and policy efforts that touch all of those things. So tonight I am really excited to segue from what Lena is going to set us up with some really good background information, and I'm going to take us on a little bit deeper dive into the harm that neonicotinoids can pose to our pollinator populations in the state. This will set Henry and Joyce up to give us some solutions to this harm. So I will toss it over to Henry to introduce himself.
Hi, I want to thank Ruth Ann and Maggie for having us. This is really a great forum. My name is Henry Stiles. I'm a conservation and wildlife advocate with Environment Colorado. The organization basically works for clean air, clean water, wildlife, and open spaces. We're a statewide nonprofit. Um, I've done a lot of work on pesticides since being in Environment Colorado. I've also done a lot of stuff surrounded protecting our public lands and that kind of thing. Um, Really interested to talk tonight about progress that Colorado has made on this front. I do think that we are a leader in the country at protecting pollinators. We've had some significant legislation, and I'm going to talk about a specific piece of legislation we passed in 2023, and look forward to sharing that with you and what it means to all of us that we passed that. And with that, I'll kick it over to Joyce.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here tonight. I'm Joyce Kennedy, the Director of People and Pollinators Action Network, and I recognize a number of names here. So I think some of you know who we are, but we're also a statewide organization, and we're working to advocate for better pollinator habitat, less use of pesticides. What are some of those interactions with human health? And really trying to move the state forward to be the best we can be to support pollinators, often through native plants. So I'm excited to provide a few solutions that we have in store for this coming legislative session, and then just some things that individuals can do. So Lena, why don't you lead us off?
All right. Let me share my screen. Okay. Everybody can see that? Good. Okay. So as I mentioned, my work targets neonicotinoids or neonics. If you haven't heard of these before, they are a class of neurotoxic insecticides. They're the most widely used insecticide in the world. They're super duper toxic to wildlife, but especially toxic to insects like bees. And they're pretty much ubiquitous in our environment. And so the primary and most widespread use that we target, at least especially in our work in Colorado, are seed treatments. So that thin coating on crop seeds, primarily corn in Colorado, which covers over 1 million acres. And just to get an understanding of the scale that we're talking about in Colorado, just on average, there's about 30,000 of these seeds planted per acre. So multiply that by 1 million, and that's just for corn. So by far, these seed treatment uses are the most widespread use, and that's why we really try to target it. But we also target urban and landscape uses as well. And just to kind of dig a little deeper in the way that neonics work, so they permeate plant tissues. So they basically can make the whole plant toxic, especially when they're used as a seed treatment. So those chemicals will get taken up by the plant as it grows. And then the fruit, the pollen, the nectar, all of it becomes toxic to bees and any creature that consumes it. So if you're eating an apple, for example, that was treated with neonics, you can't really wash them off. The chemicals basically become infused in the fruit. And it turns out when we're talking about seed treatments, that most of the chemicals do not even get absorbed by the plant, only about 2 to 5% of it. The rest, the other 95%, can just stay in the soil where it can persist for years. It can contaminate water bodies and other nearby wildlife. And so, because of this, neonics are just about everywhere, from farms to urban landscapes. And this graph just shows the magnitude of the neonic problem that we're facing. So just to explain a little bit what this graph is, that light blue bar is the harmfulness attributable to neonics, to insect life. And that dark blue bar is that of all other insecticides combined. So they're super, super toxic. And that's why our work just focuses on trying to reduce the size of that light blue bar. And we're already seeing neonics in water bodies, which raises concerns for aquatic ecosystems. There was a study in Japan that linked the collapse of a fishery to the introduction of neonics in nearby agriculture. And we actually had an expert take a look at this problem in Colorado. And unfortunately, neonics are in our groundwater, they're in our surface water. And unfortunately, conventional water treatment, they don't filter out neonics. So what does this look like as far as ecological impacts? Just one neonic treated corn seed has enough active ingredient or chemicals to kill 250,000 bees. And they kill bugs by attacking their nervous system. And I'm sure Jacqueline will get a little bit more into this, but basically, if you've ever seen a bee that's been acutely poisoned by neonics, they'll just be twitching uncontrollably before becoming paralyzed and dying. And they don't just kill insects and invertebrates, they also kill things with spines. They can starve birds because, as we know, most birds eat insects as a food source, so neonics are starving them. But also, even directly, they hurt birds. Even a bird, a small songbird, if they eat a corn seed, they can die. And they also harm mammals. There have been a couple studies that have made the connection between neonics and birth defects in deer, including really strange things going on with their organs and deformed jaws. And of course, that is a concern ecologically speaking, but deer are big mammals and we are also big mammals. And we know from neonics just on farms that, as well as even at these seed treatment facilities and factories, that neonics raise a pretty significant workplace hazard. There was even a recent study that looked into human poisoning incidents, and the takeaway from that study was that hundreds of people have been acutely poisoned by neonics. And we're even learning more with chronic, more long-term exposures that they have a pretty big concern on early life and babies. They can be pretty alarming. And in 2016, there was CDC data that came out that found that neonics are in half of the US population. And we know this just from looking at people's urine, like the breakdown of these pesticides in their urine. And there was even a more recent study that looked at pregnant women and found that over 95% of them had neonics in their body, with the highest levels in Hispanic women, and with those levels rising every year of that study. And this is pretty concerning because there are more and more studies coming out that are linking neonic exposures to developmental neurological damage in humans, including decreased testosterone, decreased sperm amounts. I mean, really just a lot of consistent harmful effects that we're seeing with people, we're also seeing in controlled animal studies. And in addition to all of this, it raises some pretty glaring equity concerns. We know, in addition to the direct impacts on pregnant Hispanic women, we also know that, eating organic or using carbon filtration water systems at home, these are great ways to try to avoid exposures, but we know that's not available or affordable for everybody. And of course, if we lose our pollinators, nutritious food is just going to become more expensive and more inaccessible for people. So I think with that, I can hand it over to Jacqueline to get more into what this looks like ecologically.
Thank you so much, Lena, for that. really useful, but a little bit disturbing background, I am going to lead us into what this means for Colorado's pollinators. Can everyone just give me a quick thumbs up if you can see my screen okay? Perfect, thank you. So first off, why do we care about pollinators in the first place? I don't think I really need to convince this amazing group that we should care about pollinators, but I think it's always useful to see some data to back this up, right? So first off, 85% of our plant species on the planet require pollinators to reproduce. This includes some of my Colorado native favorites like blue penstemon, rabbitbrush, and of course sunflowers. And also, 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food that we eat and drink relies on pollinators for its insect population. And again, this includes some of our Colorado favorites like our Palisade peaches, apples, Rocky Ford cantaloupe, beans, tomatoes, squash. The list really goes on. So we are really lucky here in Colorado. Our state is home to over 1,000 species of bees. That's nearly a third of all the bee species in North America. And we are also home to about 300 species of butterflies, which is over 40% of the butterflies in North America, north of Mexico, in the US and Canada. This is not even mentioning the flies, beetles, wasps, moths, and other insects who serve as pollinators. So this is really some incredible diversity that honestly we stand to lose because unfortunately our pollinators are in decline. So nearly 30% of our bumblebee species in the state are imperiled. We also have 7 species of imperiled butterflies. On the ecosystem level, there was this great study that came out in 2023 that looked at insect abundance in this high elevation meadow outside Crested Butte. And what that found is that abundance of insects declined by over 60% over a 35-year period in that high elevation meadow. And at this point in time, there is really robust scientific consensus that the use and overuse of these neonicotinoid insecticides are a major driver of the pollinator declines that we are seeing here in Colorado, but also throughout the United States. So neonic use is widespread in our Colorado landscapes, from use in agriculture to use around our homes and gardens, and even use on the plants that we purchase from nurseries to support our native pollinators. Much of this use is needless. It does not benefit residents. It does not benefit growers. And so to understand why neonics are so harmful to pollinators in these spaces, I'm going to take a moment to kind of dig into how our pollinators can be exposed to these chemicals. So pollinators can be exposed to neonics, of course, from direct contact. So that is when they are sprayed directly. And so it makes sense that the risk from these kinds of exposures is highest when neonics are sprayed over places where our pollinators are likely to be. So this is our blooming crops, our weeds, and our native plants in our pollinator gardens. And this applies, of course, to bees, but also to other insects like butterflies, beetles, and flies that can be exposed in this way. Pollinators can also be exposed to neonics from residues that linger from a previous treatment. And there are a few things about neonics that Lena talked about that makes this piece so concerning. The first is that neonics are systemic. This means that they are taken up by the plant and they are present in all parts of the plant. This isn't something that you can wash off, like Lena said. It's infused into the plant tissue. It's present in the leaves, stem, pollen, and nectar. The second is that neonics are pretty long-lived. They can take months or even years to break down. And so taken together, these two pieces make these residues particularly dangerous to our pollinators. So not only bees visiting flowers and taking up that contaminated pollen and nectar, but also our caterpillars that are munching away on contaminated leaves. Now, an amazing fact that you might already know, and if you do, congratulations, you are an honorary pollinator expert, which is great company to be in. But 70% of our native bees are ground nesting. They make their homes within the soil. And we can see in this video that's playing this native cellophane bee that's in action here, going to work, digging her nest in the soil. But what this means is that our bee pollinators can be exposed to neonics even when they're nesting, even when they're not actively foraging on flowers. This is because neonics are systemic. They dissolve easily in water, and this also means that they move pretty readily in soil and persist for a long time, again, weeks, months, or even years. Some of these products are even applied directly to soil as a soil drench that's then meant to move from the soil into the target plant. And this really puts our native ground nesters at risk. Now, for both our ground nesting bees and our cavity nesters, they use plant and soil materials around them to actually build their nests. Many of you have probably spotted a beautiful leafcutter bee or seen its mark in your garden with these sort of circular discs taken out of your plants. If that leaf material is contaminated with neonics and that bee brings it back to the nest, that adult bee, as well as its offspring, are going to be exposed to these chemicals. And so, what does all this mean for our wild and managed pollinators in Colorado? So, like I mentioned before, pollinators can be exposed in our agricultural landscapes, our urban landscapes, and through the plants that we buy at nurseries. And so, I'm going to touch briefly on some research that shows us the effects in each of these spaces. So looking at how this plays out in the real world, Lena told us a lot about these treated seeds. And there is now a robust body of research from multiple sources that shows us the many ways that the exposure from these treated seeds impact our native and our managed bees. So first, we just see fewer bees in these areas compared to fields without treated seeds. So 50% fewer wild bees around these treated fields compared to untreated. Next, we see that these bees don't build their nests in these areas compared with untreated areas. 100% reduction in nesting of solitary bees in these spaces. We also see effects to bumblebee reproduction. So in these treated seed fields, we see 40% fewer male and worker bumblebees. We also see 70% fewer queens. Looking at data of our managed bees, our honeybees, we also see effects. So looking at 90 different assessments of effects on honeybees and compiling that data together, we see physiological effects from 74% of those exposures. And physiological effects include things like metabolism and respiration, things that are very important for that bee's existence. We also see behavioral effects in 58% of exposures to honeybees. And behavioral effects include things like navigation and learning. Again, essential things for the survival of these bees. And so all these effects add up. Even those that don't result in immediate death can cause populations to decline over time. So what about in our urban and residential spaces? So seed treatments are not as much of an issue in these settings, but we do see that for some reason, the labeled application rate, so how much pesticide you're allowed to apply in yards, can be much, much higher than in our agricultural areas. So some products that are labeled for ornamental uses, like on our trees and bushes in ornamental areas, they are labeled for use at rates that are 12 to 100 times higher than an equivalent product in an agricultural setting. And so because of this high toxicity and high volume, it is relatively easy to cause harm in these spaces. So for one example, in 2013, there was the largest native bee kill ever recorded in history. That occurred not in Colorado, but in Wilsonville, Oregon. And in this situation, more than 50,000 bumblebees died when over 50 blooming trees were sprayed with neonics in a parking lot. And that spray happened by a trained professional applicator. This loss of bees represents potentially hundreds of wild bee colonies, so a really big impact there. And of course, we've already touched on this issue of persistence or how long it lasts in the environment, but I think it's worth repeating. Neonics, if applied in our residential areas, can persist for weeks, months, or years in our trees, soils, turfs, pollinator plants, and even weeds in our yard. And so finally, moving to our nursery plants, even the plants that we are specifically buying to support pollinators in our landscapes could have harmful levels of neonics. These chemicals are commonly applied in a nursery setting, partially driven by consumer demand for clean, insect-free, and damage-free plants. And research has shown that this use can be really harmful to the pollinators that we are hoping to support. So, for example, there was a study that showed that milkweed treated with neonics caused 100% mortality of monarch caterpillars when they were exposed to that plant just 24 hours after it was treated. But even if we waited 2 weeks after that treatment to expose the caterpillars, we still see some dangerous effects here. 40 to 80% mortality of those monarch caterpillars exposed to plants 2 weeks after they're treated with neonics. So, in summary, here, before I toss it to Henry and Joyce to go over some solutions with us, neonics are highly toxic. They are persistent, they last a long time, and they are prone to moving away from where they were applied. Studies link neonics to widespread pollinator declines in Colorado and beyond, and needless uses in our agricultural spaces and our residential spaces are linked with major harm, with little benefit to growers and little benefit to residents. The good news is that there are solutions to this. We can be safer for pollinators, and so I will toss it over to Henry to talk about some of those.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Let me see. You see that okay? Cool. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about pollinators, pesticides, and policy, and specifically focusing on 2023 law that we passed in Colorado. I'm going to start off with just a brief intro about neonics. A lot of this was covered by Jacqueline and Lena, but I'm just going to go over a couple of things about neonics just to get us started. Um, First of all, what are neonics? They are a very toxic pesticide, extremely toxic, 1,000 times more toxic than DDTs. They are systemic, as Jacqueline said, they are taken up by the plant. So basically, they make the entire plant toxic, from roots to pollen to everything. So this is a real big problem. Another huge problem with neonics is that it gets into our soil and our water. It gets into surface water and groundwater, and it does contaminate our soil because a lot of it is, as also said, it's used as a seed treatment, and a lot of that seed coating is sloughed off into the soil when it gets wet. That pollutes the soil, groundwater, and surface water. Most commonly used insecticide in the world. So all this stuff is all over the place, and it's a neurotoxin, and that was explained earlier that it attacks the nervous system of insects, and it's also showing effects in other animals, which is concerning. Oh, first off, excuse this picture. That's a picture of catmint, and I know it's not a native, but it is recommended in Colorado, and I notice it does attract native bees, so I included it. Um, but anyway, a threat to pollinators. That we know now that neonics are a key driver in pollinator decline. They cause lethal effects and sublethal effects as well, that don't outright kill, but impair navigation, immunity, and reproduction. So they really are affecting populations of pollinators. And as I said, very, very toxic and persistent. They last in the environment for a very, very long time. So Colorado has been a leader in this space, although other states have done things as well. But Colorado's probably most well-known legislative solution was Senate Bill 23. 23 is for the year, and 266. And I should say something, I didn't write down the sponsors in here, but a couple of environmental champs we have in the legislature were prime sponsors on this bill. A shout out to Senator Kathy Kipp and uh, Representative Kyle Brown, who's also my representative here in Boulder. Kevin Priola was also a prime sponsor. He's no longer in the legislature, and also Senator Lewis, also from Boulder County. So what does 23266 do? Um, what it does is it makes neonics a limited use pesticide. Before that, it was freely available as a pesticide, and this restriction it went into place in July 1st, 2024. And so what does a limited use pesticide mean? It means that generally there are no retail sales. Neonic products are banned from general retail and virtual shelves, which is really important. I'll get to that in a minute. So you can't go into a hardware store, a big box store, garden centers, grocery stores, places like that, and you won't find things with neonics on them. Um, However, licensed applicators can use neonics. And as pointed out, this is somewhat problematic because we don't have very good training for people, and this is concerning. I mean, it's a step in the right direction, but it's really important to apply these pesticides carefully if we need to use them at all. Very important. For example, the linden tree example is just horrifying, that a licensed applicator would actually, do something like that. And it's scary that maybe they are applying these pesticides near groundwater or surface waters or just in inappropriate situations. So legislation is a step in the right direction, but there are caveats to that. Um, I'm sure some of you shop on Amazon. If you go to Amazon, I went up and looked up metocloprid, which is a particular type of neonics, and this is what I saw. You'll see the circled here. Sorry, this item cannot be shipped to your selected address due to local laws. So this is the law in action on Amazon. So that's a really good thing about this law, that this stuff isn't being sold online, in addition to not being sold in retail stores. So, what does this mean for gardeners? Or the public in general? How does this change your trip to the nursery? Um, you know, it's much harder now to accidentally buy a product that is super, super toxic to pollinators. So I think that was a step in the right direction. I think it was a clear signal to retailers to look for better alternatives, to look for pollinator-friendly products, insecticidal soap, neem oil. There are other solutions to this. And it just reduces the chance of accidental contamination in your home garden. I don't think that people carefully read labels when they buy something like this. So I think it's really good to have this off retail shelves. So here's the critical loophole in the law, and this is something that Joyce will get into later because we're trying to deal with this year. Um, the law restricts the sale of the pesticide itself, but it does not regulate plants already treated with neonics, and that includes plants that are grown from these neonic-coated seeds. And this is a huge source of the problem that we're seeing right now with respect to pollinator populations. Um, so there's just a federal loophole in pesticide-coated seeds. They are just not regulated as pesticides. And as was talked about in other presentations, one single seed is extremely toxic, enough to kill over 80,000 bees or 250,000 bees. I think this number changes, but it's a lot of bees can be killed by a single toxic seed. And widespread use, we're talking about just about every corn plant in the United States starts life as a neonic-coated seeds because these seeds are not regulated. So just a little bit about how to buy plants and seeds. Like I said, Joyce is going to get more into the details about what we can do about coated seeds legally in 2026. But for now, when you go to the nursery, ask them, are these plants neonics free? Were they grown from treated seeds? It's great to raise awareness with the nursery or whoever is selling plants to you, and you can try to buy organic. Organic seeds should not be treated, and there's also a number of Be Safe labels, and we can provide you with information about those when you go and shop for plants. Look for those. And we said we'd save questions till the end. So with that, I'll hand it off to Joyce.
Well, thanks. I am bringing up the rear of these presentations, and then we'll dive into some questions. Thanks to all of our presenters for providing excellent background information. And Jacqueline's going to be changing my slides. So Jacqueline, if you'll change the slide. And thanks, Henry, for summarizing the neonic legislation, which really has served the state well by raising greater awareness of the neonic issue. It was a really important step in the right direction, and it begins this process of restricting public access and reducing unnecessarily environmental exposures. We do want to emphasize that we're not done, and there's still a need for stronger regulation of neonics as they continue to be overused and ubiquitous in our environment. Change the slide, please. The reality is that loopholes remain. Henry, thank you for touching on a number of those. So some situations fall through the cracks of the newer regulation. Unfortunately, it's too easy to become a registered or licensed dealer through the Department of Agriculture's website. It's a really low barrier to entry to gaining this status, which means that there still are neonics on shelves and that they really can be sold to anyone who wants them if that dealer is certified by the Department of Ag. But we are really hopeful that access is more limited now due to this statute and that it is reducing homeowners' use of these chemicals as a result. It's also important to note that there is limited regulation of commercial use of neonics and neonic-coated seed in agriculture. So these are gaps that really need to be addressed. Change the slide, please. Because EPA is actively rolling back and easing regulations right now, it's more important than ever that Colorado strengthens protections at the state level. So please keep supporting state action. Keep that in mind as we get into the legislative session. Many people think if the EPA approves something, it might be safe. But truly, if the EPA approves a product for market, it does not mean it's safe. As a matter of fact, they rely on industry studies for many of their decisions around the pesticides that get released. So your consumer awareness is really crucial. It's been said before, but I'll emphasize once again that many neonic uses are just not needed. And so we need to think about ways to eliminate these unneeded uses. Slide change, please. Number one, I recommend eliminating all synthetic pesticides and fertilizers on our own properties. We can control that. Many of these products are for aesthetic purposes and therefore not needed. If a product contains neonics or synthetics, just skip it. If you must bring a product home, be thoughtful about it. Read the labels carefully because the label is the law. And if somebody is going to use a product, making sure to use it in the right quantity is important. These products can provide, or they promise quick solutions, I should say, but they come with long-term ecological costs. So please think twice. Change the slide, please. As you know, there's starting to be a shift in our cultural expectations around landscaping. we're starting to move away from the perfect lawns and high maintenance yards. But as we do that, we really also need to rethink pest and weed control because we want the goal to be ecological function, not cosmetic perfection. Slide change. A healthy landscape doesn't rely on chemical responses to every pest or weed. We really have to think about the big picture ecosystem approach to building and maintaining landscapes. It makes them more resilient and productive, and we need that in an arid climate in particular. Pesticides only treat symptoms, not the underlying cause, and that can create a treadmill of ongoing pesticide use. So instead of a product for every pest or every weed, we just need to focus on building biodiverse habitats that can naturally tolerate pressures. For example, native plants can withstand nibbling and other natural interactions. Slide change, please. Now, of course, many of you are already aware of the actions we can take in our very own yards and beyond in our communities to build healthy habitat. And so I just made one basic list here. One thing I would note is that if you are providing a water source for wildlife, be sure to refresh the water often so you don't provide breeding habitat for mosquitoes. And of course, it's the time of year where we need to bury that impulse to clean up our yards so that there's overwintering habitat for wildlife. Slide change. So beyond our personal choices, policy change is essential at the state and the local level. And two important bills will appear in Colorado's 2026 legislative session that directly address neonic use and also native plant use. Public support can make a huge difference in bringing forward policies, so we encourage you to get involved. Any questions about how that process works or how we can support you in it, please keep us in mind as mentors in that. Slide change. The Seed We Need policy proposal arose out of an educational campaign and aims to eliminate the unnecessary, we keep talking about unnecessary uses of neonic applications to agricultural seeds, especially the ones that don't benefit farmers and aren't needed for their crop success. So the idea of the policy is to essentially target those wasteful neonic uses that don't provide meaningful agricultural value. This is not a ban on neonic-coated seeds, but it would aim to eliminate the uses that do not benefit farmers or provide any meaningful insurance against pests. And of course, in turn, that will save them money. They won't have to pay for these coatings in a time where producers are stretched so thin. Important to note that farmers would still have the opportunity to use the coated seed if they are needed and approved for use. And this approach is based on a successful model that was developed in Quebec, where the neonic-coated seeds have been reduced by 95% since the policy went into effect. Similar bills have also passed in New York and Vermont. They've not been implemented yet, but there's a growing trend toward this. And I want to point out, and maybe my colleagues can put a link to the Seed We Need Colorado website in the chat. We are encouraging folks to go to this website to learn more about the campaign. There's also an opportunity to sign on to learn more, stay engaged in the process, and get involved. Change the slide, please. The second bill focuses on increasing the use of native plants on state-owned lands. It would set minimum thresholds for the percentage of natives used in restoration or renovation projects. And it would also seek to leverage the combined buying power of state agencies to increase supply and availability of native plants. In addition, the bill may include something on native plant training for state agency land managers, and a proposal to conduct a statewide study to examine native plant demand, supply gaps, and recommendations for improving the native plant marketplace. Slide change, please. Here's my email if you have any questions or have any follow-up. And I will turn it back to my colleagues to start the take a look at what questions we might have.